Hello everyone, how's it going? It's Theonor as always, and continuing with this series, I'm going to take a look at the lore of Mists of Pandaria this time. And I have to say that it's been rather difficult to come up with what to say in this video. Mists of Pandaria is one of my favorite expansions when it comes to the lore, so like with Wrath of the Lich King, I've had a bit of a hard time thinking about stuff to dislike. But not to be deterred, I have come up with said stuff. As a reminder, this video is basically a very opinionated look at 5 things I dislike about the lore of an expansion and 5 things I like about it, in addition to a small discussion on what I think of the overall direction of the story of said expansion. Now, as I always do to reiterate some things, this is just my opinion, you are free to disagree. I only address the in-game lore, not expanded universe works, which took place in the timeline of this expansion. Those things I like and the 5 I dislike are not the only things I like or dislike about the expansion, it's just sort of an artificial limitation making me narrow down my choices. Also, the things I'll mention are not in any particular order, so it won't be leading up to the thing I dislike or like the most, for instance. Now, starting off, the overall direction of Mists of Pandaria's story is the conflict of Alliance versus Horde and then everyone turning against Garrosh, but there's also the Thunder King in the first half of the story, and now when Blizzard announced this expansion, they made it clear that while Garrosh will be the end boss, it's not an expansion with a specific villain or specific threat, and that turned out to be both true and not true. Garrosh wasn't as present in the storyline as, for example, Deathwing was in Cataclysm, yet he was still obviously present and played an important role. Now, there's 3 specific things to discuss in regards to Mists of Pandaria's overall story. First is Garrosh, then the Thunder King, and finally the involvement of Pandaren and of Pandaria in the story, the Shah especially. In regards to Garrosh, I'm going to talk a little about it more when I get to the likes and dislikes, but I think the overall story in this regard was well executed. Garrosh played an effective role as a villain. Vol'jin, Chen, Stormstout, Thrall, Varian, Anduin, etc. all played their roles effectively. In many ways, this was the story of the Horde remaking itself, of showing why the old Horde variant of the Horde was to be discarded in favor of the Horde built by Thrall and Vol'jin and Cairn. Like I said, I'll get into more details when we get to the likes and dislikes, since a vast majority of those will deal with this storyline. In regards to the Thunder King, it's a storyline I particularly liked and I wish was continued after Mists of Pandaria, not necessarily with the Mogu, since they are obviously a Pandaria mostly thing, but rather with the Zandalari trolls. The Thunder King proved to be a pretty great villain to Pandaria, despite the fact that he didn't really appear in the storyline that much on account of being dead for part of it. It's interesting and I definitely like how they built up his threat in the questing areas and how he was a very credible threat without necessarily having demonstrated any power on his own directly to us. The Mogu also were, in my opinion, one of the more interesting new races added in World of Warcraft. I think I'd be willing to say that the Thunder King successfully filled the role of secondary antagonist, like Yogg-Saron in Wrath of the Lich King, for instance, was. Now on to Pandaria, the Shah, and the Pandaren. The thing about each expansion, each new continent added to the map of Azeroth, is that, in my opinion, it has to have an influence on the overall story of Warcraft. It can't just be an isolated event confined strictly to that continent with little to no bearing on the overall story of the universe. It's one of the main faults, in my opinion, of Warlords of Draenor, that it basically was a contained story that barely developed the universe's story. Filler, basically. Mists of Pandaria, on the other hand, did try to contribute to the story of Warcraft, not just by advancing the Alliance versus Horde and the Garrosh storyline, but by introducing the Pandaren and the August Celestials, and really having both factions sort of learn a lesson from these people. It's why the ending of the War Crimes novel revealed that the August Celestials plan to pardon Garrosh, since the message of Pandaria, of the Pandaren, was one of harmony, of control, and of redemption. The problem was that message didn't really go through, and it's arguably a rather cliché message in its own right. We were supposed to learn a lesson from this expansion. Instead, half the people thought that pandas were stupid and or stereotypical. The other half found their message stupid and or not fitting into the Warcraft universe. Obviously speaking hyperbole here. Mists of Pandaria really had a very deep and involving storyline, and one full of subtleties and many interpretations. And the failure of this complicated, subtle type of storytelling in the eyes of the people, deserved or not, I think poisoned the well for future expansions. Worlds of Draenor tried to overcompensate by making everything just be big, epic, exploding stuff, while Legion tried to overcompensate for both Warlords and Mists by, in many ways, being a fan fiction, having events happen just because they'd be popular rather than because they'd really contribute to the story of the universe. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Regardless of the impact of Mists of Pandaria's story, it is, like I said, one of my favorite storylines in World of Warcraft, and I can definitely see what they were going for. Overall, leaving aside how it indirectly affected the story of the future expansions, I would call it overall a positive contribution to the Warcraft universe. Now, starting with the beginning, I suppose the first thing I dislike was the pre-expansion event. Again, I'm not talking about expanded universe stuff. I would definitely recommend the novel Jaina Proudmoore Tides of War to everyone watching, and I'm definitely glad they finally decided to implement actual expanded universe stories into the actual game. It's just that it was really underwhelming. 2 scenarios, one for the Alliance, one for the Horde. While both good, is hardly enough to hype up an expansion. I would have loved to see something very reminiscent of the cinematic trail for Mists of Pandaria, perhaps having the players embark on a ship to battle the opposite faction, have them run aground in this strange, newly discovered land, perhaps on a nearby island and not on Pandaria itself, since I know that it would be complicated for people who didn't actually purchase the expansion. And then they would perhaps find some danger on that island, perhaps a dormant Shah, or they would maybe awaken a Mogu tomb, and then they would get teleported back to Stormwind or Orgrimmar the last second by a mage in their party. You can still have the Anduin storyline be part of it. In fact, I think the pre-expansion event would have been all the more epic if it ended on a cliffhanger, with Anduin disappearing. Just that, again, the pre-expansion event we got, while it did contribute to the overall Horde vs Alliance storyline, didn't really tie that in with the fact that we're about to discover a new continent. Now, speaking of Pandaria, the first thing on my like column are the Pandaren and their folklore. I really like the Pandaren personally. I find most of their stories to be interesting, and I think they fit into Warcraft's lore. What I'm referring to the most when I'm talking about this particular like, however, is rather the subtleties in their story, and more specifically their folklore again. With Pandaria and the Pandaren, the world honestly felt more alive than in previous expansion, like a real lived-in world, and that's partly, in my opinion, because of their folklore. The Pandaren have lots of legends regarding the past, and that's just the thing. They're legends. Legends are only partly true. It gave the expansion a lot of flavor, while also, like in real history and real folklore, providing many possibilities to what actually happened to the stories and events. Just for instance, in Mists of Pandaria, we learn of 2 or 3 legends of how the Thunder King died, all of which contradict each other and none of which are actually true. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. I know it's ironic that it's me saying it, but we're players, not historians. We don't have to know every little thing about a story or a universe. Rather, what we do know or find out has to be entertaining or engaging. And in my opinion, it was. The next thing I disliked was the sudden turnabout of Garrosh's character. Now, I've talked about this topic many times before. Namely, I'm referencing the fact that sometime between Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard decided to turn Garrosh evil. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. Some would argue that having Garrosh be a good guy was a bad storyline. My complaint is rather that this switch came about suddenly. Poof, and now he's forsaken all of his honor and is now evil. I think that both versions of Garrosh were done very well. His storyline as a villain was interesting and very dark, while his storyline as a good guy was also well done, and did promise the players that there's more than meets the eye to this giant brute of a war chief. But like I said, there's no or very little connection between these two. It's just a sudden switch that's been flipped, and it's inconsistent. Though, speaking of, the next thing I like was the Horde storyline in this expansion. We really got a very deep, extremely well done, in my opinion, look into what the Horde truly is. Both Garrosh's Horde and Vol'jin and Thrall's Horde. You can see what makes each of them work. You can see why some characters would prefer one over the other. And it was a really compelling story, one of the best inner faction strife stories Blizzard has ever done. At the end of the story, even if, like myself, you might be more sympathetic towards Garrosh's Horde, you can see why Vol'jin's Horde won out, and you can understand why he became War Chief. And like I said, you gained a very new and deep understanding of what the Horde truly is. On that topic though, the next thing I dislike, and this is more of a personal dislike admittedly, is that we as players weren't allowed to side with Garrosh. Admittedly, it would have meant a lot more effort on Blizzard's part, but I think actually dividing the Horde, actually dividing the player base in game, would have really sold the idea that the Horde was going through a civil war, and really would have given Mists of Pandaria a positive reputation, rather than the reputation it has now of being the Panda expansion where Garrosh turned evil. And you could have had a questline just before the siege of Orgrimmar for the Horde players who decided to join Garrosh. Say they don't succeed in an impossible mission the War Chief gave them, and are about to be executed by Malkorok and his Kor'kron. By the way, Malkorok got a bit too little development for being a fairly major character in the expanded universe. Anyway, but then after being, when they were about to be executed, Vol'jin and his rebels, knowing that you only served Garrosh out of a sense of honor, perhaps rather than actual conviction, like, say, Nazgrim did, would then rescue you. You, the Horde player, would also then feel much more involved in the story. You would really come to understand Vol'jin's point of view if you hadn't already. That the Horde does not abandon its own, basically. The next thing I like is the Landfall Campaign and the escalation of the Horde and Alliance conflict. I think this expansion, out of all of the expansions, was the most Horde versus Alliance oriented. It really pushed the story and the idea of faction conflict to a boiling point. It was a pretty brave and smart thing to do, and Landfall, patch 5.1, was a great storyline to tell from that point of view. It advanced the story of the expansion for both factions wonderfully, and was one of the darkest and most intriguing patches in World of Warcraft. Vol'jin's assassination attempt, the conflict in Krasarang itself, the Divine Bell, the Purge of Dalaran, all of it were great additions to the story. Though speaking of, the next thing I dislike was the Alliance storyline in patch 5.3 and somewhat in patch 5.4. Now, I will admit I did not play Alliance myself in Mists of Pandaria, so I'm perhaps not as emotionally invested in this as some more hardcore Alliance players are, but I understand and agree with their complaints in context. If, say, I were to take the story of Warcraft on its own, ignoring the fact that you can play both factions, ignoring the fact that there are players in this world, just taking it as a structured, independent story, I would say that the limited alliance involvement made sense, since the latter half of Mists of Pandaria was about the Horde civil war. But you can't leave those things aside. The fact is that, like I said, this expansion has stoked the fires of faction conflict the most out of any other expansion. You have to give both factions a satisfying end. And the Alliance didn't really get that. Sure, technically speaking, you were the dominant faction after all was said and done, but that's strictly from a logical, aloof standpoint rather than looking at things on the ground from a personal standpoint. In 5.3, the Alliance got to play spy, they scouted out some of Garrosh's forces, found out about the Horde civil war, and then joined the Darkspears. And that's it. They were just an attachment, a side story to the Horde storyline that was going on. Admittedly, it's pretty difficult to find something logical for the Alliance to do in that particular story, without seeming perhaps overkill, for instance, but really, when they decided to fan these flames so high, they had to give a bit of a reward at the end. The next thing I like is more of a personal preference, again, namely the Younggo. The Younggo are probably one of the least important races in the storyline of Mists of Pandaria, but I really like them, and that's mostly down to personal preference. I'm a really big fan, so to say, of the historical Mongols, and the Younggo are pretty much that, only with more fire. Plus they have that awesome music. My final dislike, which is admittedly a small one, was that the siege of Orgrimmar, the parts before actually entering the city but after dealing with the Shah of Pandaria, felt a bit small. The armada you can see in the distance just stood there, while the players and a handful of NPCs assaulted some fairly lightly defended fortifications, and of course Dalaran was absent from this when it could have made a lot more thematic sense to have it park above Orgrimmar and start bombarding the place. Blizzard has said, however, that doing the things I've mentioned would have been very straining on the players' computers and on World of Warcraft itself, the game, so I understand that, but still it felt a little disappointing. And the final thing I like is the Zandalari trolls, and the troll storyline in general in this expansion. Like I mentioned in other videos, trolls are my all-time favorite race in Warcraft. And interestingly enough, their story is probably developed the most in this expansion than in any other, and I'm not talking about Vol'jin and the Darkspears necessarily. I really like what they did with the Zandalari in this expansion, how they portrayed their relationship with the Mogu and the Thunder King, and with the inhabitants of Pandaria in general. And I like this ideological conflict that they expanded upon here, namely between the imperialistic Zandalari and the honor-bound Darkspears, although admittedly that was expanded more in the novel Vol'jin Shadows of the Horde rather than the actual game. Still, I don't think I have any complaints regarding the portrayal of the Zandalari in this expansion. Trolls be awesome, mon. So I suppose this is the end of this particular video. Leave any thoughts in the comments below. I'm sure this is my most controversial 5 things I like and dislike I've done so far. Guys, just wait until it comes to talk about World of Draenor. Other than that, I will see you all later. Farewell.